Pre-1846, Mexico and Alta California, a frontier on the edge of two worlds. When Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, it inherited a vast and varied empire. Among its most remote and underdeveloped regions was Alta California, a rugged and sparsely populated province stretching from present-day San Diego to the northern reaches of San Francisco Bay. Though rich in potential, Alta California was, in the 1820s and 1830s, a marginal frontier, more a dream of empire than a functioning extension of the Mexican heartland. 1. The geography of isolation. Alta California's challenges began with its geographic isolation. Overland routes from Mexico City to California were grueling and dangerous, traversing vast deserts and mountain ranges. Sea routes were unreliable and infrequent. This meant that even though Alta California was technically a Mexican possession, central authority from Mexico was distant and weak. For much of the early 19th century, the region was governed in name more than in function. Governors appointed by Mexico often lacked the resources or manpower to enforce their authority. Local leaders, often military officers or landowners, wielded disproportionate power. 2. The Spanish legacy and Mexican transition under Spanish rule 1769 to 1821. California had been a mission-dominated society. The Catholic Church established 21 missions from San Diego to Sonoma, aimed at converting and assimilating indigenous peoples into European culture and religion. Alongside these missions, Spain established a handful of presidios, military forts, and pueblos, civilian settlements, to cement its claim on the region. When Mexico took control, one of its first acts was to secularize the missions. Between 1833 and 1836, the mission system was dismantled and land redistributed, often not to the indigenous populations as promised, but to powerful Mexican families and military officers, leading to the creation of the rancho system. The Rancho era marked a dramatic shift in California's land ownership. Thousands of acres were granted to individuals loyal to the Mexican regime. These ranchos became the economic heart of Alta California, raising cattle for hides and tallow, which were exported through coastal ports like Monterey and San Diego. Life on a rancho was rugged, aristocratic, and deeply hierarchical. Californios, the Spanish-speaking elites of the region, became the dominant social class. They styled themselves after Spanish nobility, living in adobe homes, hosting rodeos, and maintaining strong family networks. Yet they operated in a vacuum, largely cut off from Mexico proper and increasingly dependent on trade with foreign ships, particularly Americans and British merchants. 3. Indigenous displacement and resistance. While Mexican leaders promised equality for all, including native peoples, in practice, the end of the missions often led to further dispossession. Indigenous Californians, already decimated by disease and mission labor, found themselves without land or protection. Many fled to the interior or took jobs as laborers on the ranchos, while others formed resistance communities in the mountains and deserts. Some regions saw periodic raids or uprisings by native groups defending their lands and autonomy. The Mexican government, however, had neither the manpower nor the resolve to integrate these communities or protect their rights, leading to a cycle of marginalization and violence. 4. Weak governance and local autonomy. Politically, Alta California drifted ever further from Mexico. Governors came and went, often appointed from Mexico, with little understanding of local dynamics. Some were resisted or ignored outright. Regional military commanders and ranchero elites wielded more actual influence than distant federal authorities. Between 1836 and 1845, a series of local uprisings and power grabs occurred. One key moment was the Alvarado Revolt in 1836, when California leaders in Monterey declared California an independent state, at least temporarily, seeking autonomy within a federalist Mexico. Though short-lived, This reflected the growing belief among Californios that Mexico City had little practical control over their lives. 5. Foreign visitors and economic entanglement as Mexico struggled to maintain control. Foreign ships became a lifeline. Russian, British, and especially American merchants visited California's ports regularly to trade for hides, tallow, and other goods. American whalers, trappers, and settlers began to arrive in small but steady numbers. These traders brought not only goods, but ideas of democracy, Protestantism, and most importantly, the belief in manifest destiny. Increasingly, American interest in California intensified, especially as settlers moved westward into Oregon and beyond. The Californios, while proud of their heritage, often saw American goods and ships as more reliable than Mexican ones. Some even married into American families, such as John Sutter, the Swiss immigrant granted land in the Sacramento Valley, or Thomas Larkin, the U.S. consul in Monterey, who maintained deep ties with local elites. 6. Signs of instability by the early 1840s. Alta California was a politically fragile, economically precarious region. It was Mexican on paper, Californio in practice, and increasingly influenced by American commerce and settlers. Mexico, weakened by internal conflict including the loss of Texas in 1836, could no longer effectively defend or administer its northernmost provinces. This opened the door for increasing foreign interference, especially from the United States. American newspapers, explorers, and politicians began speaking openly of California's inevitable destiny to join the Union. 7. A powder keg before the storm by 1845. Alta California was a powder keg of conflicting interests. Californios sought greater autonomy but lacked unity. Indigenous communities faced cultural collapse and land loss. American settlers, though few, were vocal and well-connected. The Mexican government, meanwhile, rotated governors rapidly, trying to regain control. Into this volatile mix would soon come the Bear Flag Revolt, the Mexican-American War, and a permanent transformation of the land and its people. Conclusion: a region in flux. Alta California before 1846 was not merely a peaceful Mexican territory stolen by outside forces. It was a region already drifting from Mexican control, reshaped by economic change, foreign influence, and internal divisions. The Mexican state's failure to build strong institutions in California left it vulnerable to U.S. expansion. But this does not erase the cultural depth or historical claim of the Mexican and indigenous communities that called the region home. Their legacy continues to shape California's story, a story too often overshadowed by the myth of peaceful American destiny. The Bear Flag Revolt, June 14, July 9, 1846. A republic born in rebellion, the early summer of 1846. As the winds of war stirred between the United States and Mexico, a small group of American settlers in Northern California rose in open revolt against Mexican rule. They captured the town of Sonoma, declared the creation of the California Republic, and raised a hastily painted banner that came to be known as the Bear Flag. Though the so-called Bear Flag Republic lasted less than a month, the revolt served as a flashpoint in the larger struggle for control over California, and it marked a symbolic turning point in the American conquest of the West. 1. The strategic context. Tensions on the frontier. By 1846, California was still officially part of Mexico, but the region had become increasingly unstable. Mexican governance was weak and inconsistent, and the region's elite, the Californios, held most of the power, but were increasingly divided between loyalty to Mexico and autonomy. Meanwhile, American expansionists, encouraged by the ideology of manifest destiny, viewed California as a natural addition to the United States. The U.S. had already annexed Texas in 1845, and war with Mexico loomed on the horizon down the north of California. especially around the Sacramento Valley, a growing population of Anglo-American settlers, many of them immigrants who had moved west via Oregon or the Sierra Nevada, began to fear that Mexican officials would expel them or crack down on immigration. Rumors of Mexican reinforcements arriving to disarm or deport foreigners were widespread. 2. Rising friction, American fear, and Mexican suspicion. The Mexican Comandante General of Alta California, Jose Castro, issued warnings against unauthorized immigration and settlement. He and Governor Pio Pico both viewed the increasing number of American settlers with suspicion. At the same time, the U.S. Navy, under Commodore John D. Sloat, was stationed off the Pacific coast, awaiting orders. Unbeknownst to most in California, war between the United States and Mexico had already broken out in May 1846. But news had not yet reached the West Coast. Into this fog of uncertainty stepped Captain John C. Fremont, U.S. Army officer and explorer who had entered California with an expedition team ostensibly for surveying. In reality, Fremont was a man of aggressive ambition and nationalist zeal. He had already stirred tensions by building a fort on Mexican soil earlier in the spring, and although he initially retreated to Oregon, he returned in June just as discontent was reaching a boiling point. 3. The spark, seizing Sonoma. The morning of June 14, 1846, a group of 33 armed American settlers, inspired and possibly encouraged by Fremont, carried out a daring but bloodless assault on the town of Sonoma in the North San Francisco Bay Area. The rebels surrounded the home of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, the respected Mexican military commander of the region and a prominent California rancher. Vallejo, who was ironically sympathetic to the idea of U.S. annexation, welcomed the men inside and offered wine, hoping for a peaceful resolution. Nevertheless, he and several others were taken prisoner and sent to Sutter's Fort, more than 80 miles away. The town of Sonoma was then declared seized in the name of the Free Settlers of California. 4. The flag and the Republic to symbolize their rebellion. The insurgents hastily crafted a flag, a rough cotton sheet painted with a single 5-pointed red star, a crude image of a grizzly bear, and the words, California Republic. Thus was born the Bear Flag Republic. Its leaders were an informal group with no constitutional framework. The most prominent among them was William B. Ide, who declared himself the head of the California Republic and issued a proclamation to the inhabitants of California, claiming the revolt was not against the people of California, but against the Mexican government that had failed to protect individual rights. We are not revolutionists. We are citizens asserting our rights under a tyrannical and weak system of government. William B. Ide, Bear Flag Proclamation. However, the rebel leadership lacked cohesion, a clear plan, or any real military force to defend their self-declared republic. 5. Fremont's role, silent mastermind or opportunist. Captain John C. Fremont never officially led the revolt, but his influence loomed large. His party of heavily armed men joined the Bear Flaggers soon after Sonoma was taken. While he avoided taking formal responsibility, Fremont was widely seen as the movement's true commander. His support gave the rebellion a veneer of U.S. military legitimacy. In private correspondence and later memoirs, Fremont implied that he encouraged the revolt to prepare the ground for American annexation. Its ambiguous status, neither fully under orders nor acting entirely on his own, allowed him to maneuver without constraint. 6. Collapse of the Republic. The U.S. arrives just 25 days after it was declared. The Bear Flag Republic came to an end on July 7, 1846. 2 days before the formal dissolution, Commodore John D. Sloat, commanding the U.S. Pacific Squadron, landed at Monterey and raised the American flag, declaring California a territory of the United States. 2 days later, on July 9, U.S. Navy Lieutenant Joseph Revere, grandson of Paul Revere, arrived in Sonoma. He lowered the Bear Flag and replaced it with the Stars and Stripes. The Bear Flag Republic was absorbed without resistance into U.S. military authority. 7. Aftermath and legacy. Mariano Vallejo was eventually released, though he lost much of his influence and land in the years that followed. William B. I'd faded from prominence, though he later claimed a place in the pantheon of California's founders. Fremont, hailed as a hero, was appointed military governor of California, though his career soon became marred by controversy. The Bear Flag became a lasting symbol of California's rebellious spirit and is now stylized as the state flag of California. Yet the revolt also ushered in a new era of foreign domination, land dispossession, and cultural marginalization for Californios and indigenous communities. The U.S. would go on to consolidate control over California, leading to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Conclusion: a revolt. A myth, a moment. The Bear Flag Revolt occupies a unique place in California history. It was a minor military engagement, but a major symbolic act, one that reflected the anxieties of settlers, the ambitions of American expansionists, and the fragility of Mexican authority. Though the California Republic was short-lived, its spirit lives on, both in the romanticized myths of American pioneers and in the deeper, more sobering truth of how California was wrenched away from Mexico under the banners of Manifest Destiny. 1846 to 1848. The Mexican-American War, Manifest Destiny, and the seizure of California. The Mexican-American War, which raged from 1846 to 1848, was one of the most consequential land controversial wars in U.S. history, ostensibly sparked by a border dispute between the United States and Mexico. The conflict was, in fact, the product of a deeper, more sweeping ideology, Manifest Destiny. The belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, this war marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the American Southwest and paved the way for the U.S. annexation of nearly half of Mexico's territory, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other modern states. 1. The Road to War. Polk's expansionist agenda in 1845. James K. Polk was elected President of the United States on an aggressive, expansionist platform. A strong believer in Manifest Destiny, Polk had already presided over the annexation of Texas, which had been an independent republic since breaking away from Mexico in 1836. The annexation outraged Mexico, which had never officially recognized Texas's independence and still claimed the territory. A further flashpoint emerged over the border. Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the northern boundary of Texas, while the U.S. claimed the Rio Grande, significantly more expansive boundary. In early 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move American troops into the disputed area between the two rivers, essentially baiting Mexico into a confrontation. When Mexican cavalry attacked a U.S. patrol near the Rio Grande in April 1846, Polk declared that American blood has been shed on American soil, and Congress quickly authorized war. 2. The Two-Front War. Taylor and Scott in the East, California in the West. The war unfolded in two main theaters. In the East, U.S. forces under General Zachary Taylor advanced into northern Mexico, winning major battles at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey. Later, General Winfield Scott launched an amphibious assault on Veracruz and marched all the way to Mexico City, capturing the capital in September 1847. In the West, U.S. focused on California and New Mexico, remote territories under Mexican control but lightly defended and already experiencing internal instability. It was in California that the war's consequences would be most immediate and lasting. 3. The California Front. War amidst rebellion. Before the formal declaration of war, Tensions in California were rising. In June 1846, a group of American settlers in Sonoma staged the Bear Flag Revolt, seizing the town and proclaiming the short-lived California Republic. The revolt was encouraged by Captain John C. Fremont, a U.S. Army officer and explorer who had been operating in the region under ambiguous orders. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, under Commodore John D. Sloat, had been monitoring events from offshore. When word of hostilities with Mexico finally reached the West Coast in July 1846, Sloat moved quickly to occupy Monterrey, the Mexican provincial capital. Within days, U.S. forces took control of San Francisco, Sonoma, and other key ports, effectively ending organized Mexican authority in Northern California. The Bear Flag was taken down, and the American flag raised in its place. 4. The military campaign in California. Despite initial successes, resistance continued in Southern California, where Mexican loyalists and Californios organized to drive out the Americans. In late, American forces under Captain Archibald Gillespie were expelled from Los Angeles during the Siege of Los Angeles, a major morale boost for Mexican-lined forces. In response, U.S. reinforcements under Commodore Robert F. Stockton and General Stephen W. Kearny moved to retake the region. The campaign culminated in two significant clashes. Battle of San Pascual, December 6, 1846. A bloody and inconclusive skirmish between Kearny's dragoons and California lancers. Battle of Rio San Gabriel and Battle of La Mesa, January 1847. Decisive U.S. victories that led to the retaking of Los Angeles and the collapse of California resistance. On January 13, 1847, the war in California officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Cahuenga, negotiated between Fremont and California leader Andres Pico. The treaty promised that Californios who laid down their arms and swore loyalty to the United States would be protected. 5. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the formal transfer of territory. While fighting continued in central Mexico, negotiations for peace began. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, ending the war. Under its terms, Mexico ceded over 500,000 square miles of land, about half of its territory, to the United States. The U.S. agreed to pay $15 million in compensation and assumed $3.25 million in American claims against Mexico. The U.S. promised to respect the rights of Mexican citizens in the newly acquired territories, including land ownership and legal protections. Though the treaty formally recognized California as part of the United States, its promises to protect the rights of Californios and indigenous peoples were largely ignored or broken in the following decades. 6. Aftermath, land, gold, and dispossession. 9 days after the treaty was signed, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near the American River, the California Gold Rush 1848 to 1855 transformed the region overnight, attracting hundreds of thousands of settlers and fortune-seekers for the Californios. The original Mexican landowners, the post-war era, brought decline. Under the Land Act of 1851, they were forced to prove ownership in U.S. courts, an expensive and often futile process. Many lost their ranchos to speculators, debt, or fraud. Indigenous Californians fared even worse, suffering catastrophic population decline due to violence, disease, forced labor, and displacement. 7. Legacy of the war, power, expansion, and controversy. The Mexican-American War achieved the strategic goals of President Polk and the American expansionists. It gave the U.S. unquestioned control of the Southwest, including California, and allowed the country to emerge as a true continental power. But the war also exposed deep divisions within the United States. Many Northerners opposed the war, viewing it as an imperialist effort to expand slave territory. Prominent Americans like Abraham Lincoln and Henry David Thoreau criticized the war as unjust and immoral. Mexico, for its part, entered a prolonged period of political instability, economic devastation, and resentment toward its northern neighbor. Conclusion: California claimed, but at what cost? Between 1846 and 1848, the United States took California from Mexico through a combination of settler rebellion, military conquest, and diplomatic pressure, while the U.S. framed the conflict as a fulfillment of destiny. For many Mexicans, Californios, and native peoples, it was a story of loss, betrayal, and broken promises. The American flag flying over California was not the result of a popular vote or peaceful transition. It was the product of warfare and ambition, a symbol of manifest destiny realized at great cost. January 13, 1847. The Treaty of Cahuenga, peace without a country. The Treaty of Cahuenga, though not a formal treaty in the international sense, was one of the most pivotal moments in California's transition from Mexican territory to U.S. control. It wasn't signed in Washington or Mexico City, but in a humble adobe structure near present-day Los Angeles, at a place known as Campo de Cahuenga. Its importance rests not in grandeur, but in pragmatism. It was a surrender, a negotiation, and a silent revolution all at once. Background: a war comes to California by the start of 1847. The Mexican-American War had been raging for nearly a year, although the main theaters of the war centered on northern Mexico and Texas. California had become an unexpected and strategically vital battleground. Following the Bear Flag Revolt in June 1846 and the arrival of U.S. naval forces along the Pacific coast, the U.S. began systematically asserting its authority over Mexican-held Alta California, though many northern cities had fallen under U.S. control. Southern California, particularly around Los Angeles and San Diego, remained hotly contested. Mexican Californio forces under General José María Flores, supported by local ranchers and civilians, mounted a resistance campaign against the American occupiers. But the tide was turning. U.S. forces under Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont, Commodore Robert F. Stockton, and General Stephen W. Kearny gradually gained the upper hand. By January 1847, it was clear that Mexican resistance was unsustainable. The meeting at Campo de Cahuenga on January 13, 1847, Andres Pico, commander of the remaining Californio forces, met with John C. Fremont, commander of the California Battalion, to negotiate terms of surrender. The setting was symbolic. The Campo de Cahuenga, a modest adobe ranch house near what is now Universal City in Los Angeles. There were no diplomats in tailored coats, no polished marble tables, just military men in dust-covered uniforms, surrounded by dry hills and wary soldiers. The resulting document, known as the Treaty of Cahuenga, was not ratified by either government, but was a ceasefire agreement. It had profound consequences. Key terms of the treaty: complete cessation of hostilities in California between U.S. and Mexican forces. Mexican Californio fighters were granted amnesty and allowed to return to their homes. Those who surrendered and took an oath of loyalty to the United States would be permitted to keep their property, weapons, and civil rights. No prisoners were to be taken. Those captured were to be immediately released. This act of reconciliation was almost shockingly generous, especially in an era of conquest and annexation. The treaty was written by Fremont, but signed by Andres Pico and several others. It was later honored by Stockton and Kearny. Though tensions remained among U.S. commanders about who had the right to negotiate, the role of John C. Fremont's actions were controversial. He negotiated independently, even as Stockton and Kearny disputed command over California. Nevertheless, the terms he brokered held, and his decision to prioritize peace over punishment may have spared California from prolonged guerrilla warfare. Fremont would later face a court-martial for overstepping authority, but in California's history, his boldness at Cahuenga marked a defining transition. The fate of the Californiosti. Treaty of Cahuenga's protections for Californios seemed fair on paper. However, as California moved towards statehood and the influx of Anglo-American settlers surged during the gold rush, the promises made in 1847 were increasingly violated or ignored. Many Californios lost their land grants through legal battles, fraud, or bureaucratic erosion. Despite pledges of equal rights, they were increasingly marginalized in a rapidly anglicized society. Still, the Treaty of Cahuenga stood as a symbolic gesture, a moment when dignity was offered instead of destruction. Legacy and historical impact. The Treaty of Cahuenga is often seen as the precursor to the formal Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Ended the Mexican-American War and ceded California to the U.S. Campo de Cahuenga, is now a California state historic monument, commemorated for its pivotal role in state and national history. The event highlighted the pragmatism of American expansion, as well as the fragile protections offered to indigenous and Mexican populations during the annexation era. A quiet ending. A loud aftermath. There were no parades or cannons at Campo de Cahuenga. No ink on golden parchment. Just dust, handshakes, and worn-down men trying to prevent more bloodshed. But from that moment forward, the era of Mexican California was over, and the age of American dominion had begun. The Treaty of Cahuenga, in many ways, was a footnote in a larger story, yet it tells us everything about the choices made during America's march westward. Choices between violence and negotiation, between honoring promises and breaking them. It may not have changed the fate of a continent, but for one moment, it offered peace in a time of conquest. February 2nd, July 4th, 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a land traded for peace's cannon smoke, cleared across northern Mexico, and the American flag flew from the Pacific to the Rio Grande. Both nations, exhausted, bloodied, and politically pressured, turned to diplomacy. On February 2, 1848, representatives of the United States and Mexico met in Guadalupe Hidalgo, a small town just north of Mexico City, to finalize a treaty that would forever redraw the map of North America. A humiliating concession for Mexico. For Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a bitter pill. The war, sparked by border disputes and U.S. ambition for continental expansion, had resulted in the military occupation of Mexico City itself, with no means to continue fighting. Mexico agreed to cede nearly 55% of its pre-war territory on area, encompassing all or parts of what would become California. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and portions of Colorado and Wyoming. The loss wasn't just geographic hit, was deeply symbolic. This was land Mexico had inherited from Spain after its 1821 independence. A vast frontier it had struggled to populate and govern, but nonetheless considered sacred. To many in Mexico, the cession felt like the final triumph of American imperialism and betrayal by their own faltering government. America's purchase, a convenient fiction. The United States agreed to pay $15 million to Mexico and assume up to $3.25 million in debts owed to American citizens by the Mexican government. But many historians debate whether this payment constituted a genuine purchase or a diplomatic fig leaf to disguise conquest. In reality, U.S. troops had already seized and occupied the territory. The money simply smoothed over a peace settlement and legitimized America's control in the eyes of the world. To expansionists and proponents of manifest destiny, the treaty was a triumph. President James K. Polk, who had instigated the war by sending troops into disputed Texas territory, had achieved his bold goal. America had extended from sea to shining sea. The Pacific coast, especially the harbors of San Francisco and San Diego, was now under U.S. control, unlocking new commercial and military possibilities. The fate of the people who stayed. The treaty promised benevolent terms to Mexican nationals living in the ceded lands. It gave them the option to relocate south to Mexican territory or to remain and become U.S. citizens. In theory, those who chose to stay were guaranteed the protection of their property and civil rights. But in practice, these promises were often hollow. Many Californios, the Mexican landowners and aristocrats who had governed Alta California under Spain and Mexico, quickly found themselves overwhelmed. American courts refused to honor land grants. English-speaking settlers flooded into the territory, especially after the discovery of gold in 1848, and used legal manipulation, fraud, and violence to displace the original landholders. Over time, Californios lost nearly all their ancestral lands. Indigenous people, who had already suffered under Spanish and Mexican rule, fared even worse. The new U.S. government did not consider them part of the treaty's protected populations. They were hunted, massacred, and forcibly removed from lands they had lived on for millennia. From war's end to nation-building, the ratification process of the treaty took several months. The U.S. Senate ratified it on March 10, 1848, with modifications. Mexico accepted the changes under duress on May 19, and final documents were exchanged on July 4, 1840, the day Americans celebrated their own independence. But for many Mexicans and native Californians, that date would come to symbolize the beginning of dispossession, a treaty remembered and ignored today. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo remains a powerful symbol. Mexican Americans often invoke it in struggles over civil rights, land claims, and historical recognition. Its lofty promises of equality and protection are viewed as promises broken by a nation that expanded westward, not through democracy, but through conquest. The treaty was the legal instrument by which California entered the American Union. But its true legacy is much more complex, a legacy of power, identity, loss, and the rewriting of a continent's destiny. Post-war, property and legal displacement in California. Aftermath of the Mexican-American War and the challenge of land ownership when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, formally ending the Mexican-American War. It included specific provisions intended to protect the property rights of Mexican citizens living in the territories ceded to the United States, including California. Article 8 of the treaty guaranteed that existing land grants would be inviolably respected, promising that Mexican landowners could keep their properties and that their titles would be recognized under U.S. law. However, the reality for many Californio landowners proved far harsher than this promise. The 1851 California Land Act and Legal Challenges, 1851. The U.S. Congress passed the California Land Act to implement the treaty's property provisions and bring order to land ownership in the rapidly changing state. The law required all holders of Mexican land grants to present their claims before a newly established board of land commissioners. Landowners had to prove the legitimacy and boundaries of their grants through complex legal procedures. This was a monumental task because burden of proof on landowners, Mexican landowners who previously only needed to show their grants to local officials, now faced a formal legal process that placed the burden of proof squarely on them. Language and cultural barriers. Most Californios spoke Spanish and were unfamiliar with the American legal system. They often had little access to reliable translators or legal counsel. Uncertain documentation. Many land grants were vaguely described with boundaries marked by natural landmarks rather than surveyed plots. In some cases, original documentation was lost, destroyed, or never formally recorded. Lengthy and costly litigation. Legal battles could drag on for years, sometimes decades, with high legal fees, survey costs, and court expenses that many landowners could not afford. The legal and financial trap. Losing lands despite treaty. Protections despite the treaty's assurances. The practical effects of the Land Act often contradicted those guarantees. Many landowners who could not adequately prove their claims, or who ran out of money defending them, lost their lands altogether. Common consequences included forced sales and loss of property. Facing overwhelming legal costs, some landowners sold portions of their property to pay debts or legal fees. Others lost their land when claims were rejected by the courts. Land speculators and American settlers. Opportunistic speculators and new settlers took advantage of the legal confusion. They bought disputed lands cheaply or filed competing claims, further complicating ownership. Displacement of California's many original landowners, often wealthy ranchers and prominent families during Mexican rule, found themselves dispossessed, reduced to poverty, or forced to become tenant farmers on lands they once owned outright. Impact on indigenous and mestizo populations, native peoples and mixed-race Californians, already marginalized under Mexican rule, or further dispossessed, as U.S. property law did not recognize their communal or informal land rights. Examples of notable land losses: some of California's largest and most famous ranchos originally granted during Spanish and Mexican rule were lost during this period. For instance, Rancho San Pedro, initially granted to the Dominguez family, much of this land was eventually sold off amid legal battles. Rancho Petaluma, owned by Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, a prominent Californio military and political figure. The grant's boundaries were contested, leading to fragmentation. Rancho San Francisco, in the Santa Clarita Valley. Legal challenges and foreclosures broke up large ranch holdings into smaller parcels. Long-term consequences: the displacement caused by the 1851 Land Act reshaped California's social and economic landscape. End of the Californio era. The traditional elite class of Californio landowners was largely dismantled, replaced by Anglo-American settlers and businessmen. Shift to capitalist land use. Large ranchos gave way to subdivided farms, towns, and urban development under American property law. Legal precedent for land claims in the West, the Land Act set a model that was later applied to other territories acquired by the U.S., often resulting in similar dispossession of indigenous and Mexican landowners. Summary: though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to protect Mexican landowners in California, the 1851 California Land Act created a complex and expensive legal system that often worked against those very protections. The burden of proof, legal costs, cultural barriers, and aggressive land speculation led to widespread dispossession, fundamentally altering the state's demographic and economic fabric. The displacement of Mexican-era landowners under this system remains a pivotal and contested chapter in California's history. Post-war property and legal displacement in California 1850s and beyond. After the Mexican-American War 1846 to 1848 ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, California officially became part of the United States. The treaty included provisions meant to protect the property rights of Mexican citizens residing in the newly acquired territories. Article 8 of the treaty specifically guaranteed that Mexican landowners would retain ownership of their land, promising that their property rights would be inviolably respected. However, the reality on the ground diverged sharply from these assurances. The 1851 California Land Act and its burden on landowners. In 1851, the California State Legislature passed the Land Act of 1851. This act required all holders of land titles that predated U.S. sovereignty, primarily Californios, the Mexican landowning elite, to present proof of their land claims before a specially created body called the Public Land Commission. Claimants had to file their claims within 2 years or lose their land rights altogether. The law placed the burden of proof squarely on the Mexican landowners, who are often unfamiliar with the American legal system, its language, and procedures. Their land claims had been granted under Mexican land law, often documented with informal or vague boundaries, sketch maps, deseos, and sometimes only oral testimony. The Public Land Commission, staffed mostly by Americans, scrutinized these claims intensely. To prove ownership, claimants needed to produce official documentation, such as deeds, grants, or maps. Many Mexican landowners lacked these formal documents because Mexican authorities had operated under different legal standards, and records were sometimes incomplete, lost, or destroyed during the war. Legal costs and lengthy litigation, proving a claim was a costly and protracted process. Landowners often had to hire lawyers, usually American attorneys, unfamiliar with Spanish and Mexican legal customs, and translators to navigate the legal proceedings. Court cases dragged on for years, sometimes decades, as appeals were filed up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Legal fees, court costs, and the financial strain of maintaining their estates during litigation forced many landowners to sell portions of their property or mortgage their lands, often at a fraction of the value. Some lost their lands entirely because they could not afford to defend their claims or because they failed to meet stringent evidentiary requirements. This legal ordeal disproportionately favored American settlers and speculators who had the resources and knowledge to exploit the system. Many Californio families, who had once been wealthy and influential, were reduced to poverty, confiscation, and displacement despite the treaty's protections. The Land Act effectively facilitated the transfer of millions of acres from Mexican Californios to American settlers, ranchers, and railroad companies. Large ranchos were subdivided, sold, or foreclosed upon. The disruption caused widespread displacement of Californio families, many of whom lost their homes, livelihoods, and social status. The displacement also led to broader social upheaval. The Californio elite was marginalized politically and economically, losing its prominence. The newcomers brought different customs, economic models, and attitudes, reshaping California's society and land ownership patterns permanently. Examples and notable cases: Rancho San Pedro, the land grant to the Dominguez family was eventually confirmed, but only after years of legal battles. Rancho Petaluma, owned by Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, an important Californio leader. Much of the land was lost due to legal fees and sales to pay debts. Rancho Siscal, the land grant to General Vallejo's brother, was challenged and lost after protracted court cases. These examples illustrate the pattern of displacement, protracted litigation draining resources, forced sales, and loss of ancestral lands. Broader impacts and legacy: the 1851 Land Act and subsequent legal processes reflect how law and policy can serve as tools of colonial domination, undermining treaty rights under the guise of legal formalism. This land dispossession contributed to the erosion of Mexican-American culture and the socioeconomic decline of Californios. Moreover, the land struggles in California set a precedent for later legal and political battles over land and indigenous rights throughout the American West, showing how expansionism often entailed dispossession beyond military conquest. Core themes examined in the film was California Stolen. 1. The military conquest and coercive diplomacy. The documentary foregrounds the aggressive military campaign the United States waged against Mexico during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. California, as a northern Mexican territory, is invaded by relatively small but strategically positioned American forces who seized key ports and towns. Often encountering little organized resistance, the film scrutinizes the role of military intervention in facilitating territorial acquisition. How U.S. military presence and occupation of Californio settlements disrupted Mexican governance and society. The documentary argues that this military campaign was not merely a defensive or limited conflict, but a deliberate effort fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny. The belief that the U.S. was destined to expand coast to coast, following military action, Coercive diplomacy shaped the peace terms. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which formally ended the war, is depicted not as a fair agreement, but as a negotiated document signed under duress. The film explores how the treaty ceded vast Mexican territories, including California, to the U.S. for a relatively small sum and questionable political concessions. Framing this transfer as a form of imperial theft. Point 2. The question, was California stolen? Central to the documentary is the provocative question, was California stolen from Mexico? The film makes a compelling case that California's acquisition fits the criteria of a coerced territorial seizure, rather than a peaceful or mutually agreed transfer. It highlights how the military occupation and the subsequent treaties were heavily skewed in favor of the United States, disregarding the rights and sovereignty of Mexico and the local inhabitants. The narrative also challenges traditional American historical perspectives that celebrate California's annexation as a natural or inevitable step of progress. Instead, the documentary reveals the contested and unjust nature of the process, illustrating how the term stolen resonates with many Mexicans, Californios, and historians critical of manifest destinera policies. The human and cultural cost of the conquest. 1. Dispossession and loss of land. 1. Of the most profound impacts highlighted is the dispossession of Californios, the Mexican landowning elite of California. The film shows how many Californios lost their ancestral lands due to legal manipulations, fraudulent claims, and outright theft. Through archival evidence, expert interviews, and first-hand accounts, the documentary documents the wave of land loss after the war. It explains the role of U.S. legal structures, especially the 1851 California Land Act that placed the burden of proof on Mexican landowners unfamiliar with the American legal system. This led to lengthy, costly litigation, and many Californios were forced to sell or lost their property entirely. On digital forums such as Reddit, descendants and historians discuss this legacy. Most Californios lost their land by outright theft, simply providing forged documents. The documentary uses such testimony to show that legal theft was not just a theory, but a lived reality for many. 2. Marginalization and political disenfranchisement beyond land loss. Californios were politically marginalized. Once the dominant social class in California, they were gradually pushed out of power by American settlers and officials. The film shows how this power shift contributed to a lasting sense of injustice and loss of identity among Salifers. 3. Impact on native populations. The documentary also delves into the experiences of California's indigenous peoples, who faced catastrophic consequences as the American conquest accelerated settler colonization. Many native tribes suffered violence, displacement, and cultural disruption as ranchos and towns expanded under new ownership. The film underscores that while the spotlight often falls on California's losses, native peoples endured devastating demographic and cultural upheaval, often ignored in mainstream histories, transformation, and mythos. The narrative of rescue and rebuilding. 1. The story of California's rescue. The film critically examines the widespread American narrative that paints California's incorporation into the U.S. as a rescue or redevelopment. This story portrays California as a land saved from Mexican mismanagement and poverty and transformed into a prosperous, modern state through American governance and enterprise. 2. Cultural erasure and the rewriting of history. However, the documentary challenges this mythos by revealing how these narratives often obscure or erase the cultural, social, and economic destruction wrought by conquest. It questions the fairness of the so-called redevelopment, highlighting that it was often accompanied by erasure of Mexican cultural heritage, language, and traditions. The film explores how place names, land use, and local institutions were Americanized, sometimes intentionally to diminish Mexican identity. The documentary also investigates how textbooks and popular histories have sanitized this transition, minimizing the human suffering and complexities in favor of a triumphant national story. Conclusion: revisiting California's past for a fuller understanding. The film concludes by urging viewers to reconsider the legacy of California's annexation. It invites reflection on how historical narratives shape identity and memory, and why acknowledging the contested and painful realities of the past is essential to understanding California's diverse heritage today. It calls for honoring the stories of displaced Californios and Native peoples and recognizing that the land's American destiny came at great cost, challenging us to rethink concepts of justice, ownership, and nationhood. Historical context summary: California's transition 182-11851-182-12 1846. Alta California, under Mexican rule after Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821. Alta California became a northern province of the new Mexican Republic. During this period, California was a remote, sparsely populated frontier territory far from the central Mexican government in Mexico City. Mexican authorities secularized the vast missions originally established by Spain, redistributing mission lands into large ranchos grants given mostly to Californio families. These ranchos formed the economic and social backbone of Mexican California, with cattle ranching and agriculture sustaining local elites. Despite Mexican sovereignty, Alta California was isolated, with minimal infrastructure and weak governance. Settlers and indigenous populations lived under a loosely organized system of local governance, where Californio families exercised much control over land and political affairs. June-July 1846. The Bear Flag Revolt and Declaration of California. Republican tensions between the United States and Mexico escalated into war. American settlers and military adventurers in California staged the Bear Flag Revolt in June 1846. A small group of American settlers in Sonoma rebelled against Mexican authority, declaring the short-lived California Republic. They raised a flag featuring a bear and star, symbolizing their aspiration for independence or eventual U.S. annexation. The revolt lasted less than a month. Soon after, U.S. military forces arrived, absorbing the Bear Flaggers and formally beginning the American occupation of California. The revolt and occupation marked the end of effective Mexican control in the region. 1846 to 1848. U.S.-Mexico War and the conquest of California. Bear Flag Revolt was part of the larger Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, a conflict triggered by U.S. annexation of Texas and expansionist ambitions under Manifest Destiny. During the war, U.S. forces swiftly conquered Mexican territories, including California. Despite some pockets of resistance, the military campaign in California was relatively quick and decisive. Key battles and occupations of coastal towns secured U.S. control. American settlers and soldiers established a provisional government, transitioning California toward U.S. statehood. However, this military conquest also set the stage for political and social upheaval. January 13, 1847. Treaty of Cahuenga ends fighting in California. The Treaty of Cahuenga, signed on January 13, 1847, effectively ended hostilities between Mexican Californios and U.S. forces in California. Though not an official international treaty, it was a local ceasefire agreement negotiated by General Andres Pico, a Californial leader, and U.S. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont. The treaty granted amnesty to Californios who surrendered and allowed for peaceful transition of power. This agreement paved the way for U.S. civil governance and foreshadowed California's integration into the United States, but did not resolve broader territorial disputes between the two nations. February-July 1848. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo cedes California to the U.S. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Signed on February 2, 1848. Formally ended the Mexican-American War. Under its terms, Mexico ceded a vast expanse of territory to the United States, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states, representing about half of Mexico's pre-war land. The treaty stipulated that Mexican citizens residing in ceded territories would be granted U.S. citizenship and their property rights would be respected. However, enforcement of these provisions was uneven and often ignored in practice. The treaty's ratification spurred rapid migration into California, especially after the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848, accelerating demographic, economic, and political transformations. 1851 and beyond. The California Land Act and dispossession of Mexican landowners following statehood in 1850. The U.S. government passed the California Land Act of 1851, requiring all holders of land grants issued by Spanish or Mexican authorities to present their claims before a newly established Public Land Commission. The act aimed to verify land titles, but placed the burden of proof on Mexican landowners, many of whom faced linguistic, legal, and financial barriers. They had to prove ownership with often incomplete or informal documentation. Many Californios were forced into expensive and protracted legal battles to defend their lands. These processes often resulted in loss of lands due to inability to pay legal fees, forced sales of properties at undervalued prices, fraudulent claims, and forged documents submitted by opportunistic settlers, marginalization of original landowners. From political and economic power, the Land Act effectively facilitated the transfer of millions of acres from Mexican Californios to American settlers, speculators, and corporations, reshaping California's land ownership and social structure permanently. Conclusion: revisiting California's past through a revisionist lens, the documentary America Truth Story Forgotten. Was California really stolen from Mexico? Offers a powerful revisionist perspective that challenges the familiar narratives surrounding California's annexation by the United States, California's incorporation, conquest, or consent. Far from a peaceful or consensual transition, the film presents compelling evidence that California was taken through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic pressure, and legal coercion. The military occupation during the Mexican-American War disrupted Mexican governance and paved the way for American dominance. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, often portrayed as a fair settlement, is scrutinized as a document signed under duress, one that effectively ceded vast Mexican lands for minimal compensation. While promising protections that were rarely honored in practice, land dispossession and the erosion of California rights. One of the film's central revelations is how the post-war legal system, especially through mechanisms like the 1851 California Land Act, systematically stripped Mexican landowners, Californios, their ancestral lands. The documentary details the burdensome legal requirements imposed on land claimants, many of whom lacked the necessary documentation or legal expertise to defend their rights. Lengthy, expensive court battles, fraudulent practices, and outright theft led to widespread displacement of Californios and a complete restructuring of California's land ownership. The broader ideological context, manifest destiny, and expansionism. Story of conquest and dispossession did not occur in a vacuum. The documentary situates California's seizure within the broader framework of manifest destiny, the 19th century ideology that justified American territorial expansion as a divine right and national mission. Manifest destiny-fueled policies that prioritized U.S. growth over Mexican sovereignty, indigenous rights, and cultural diversity, leaving long-lasting scars on the social fabric of the region. Cultural erasure and the myth of rescue, in addition to physical land loss. The Film explores how California's cultural landscape was transformed. The Californio elite, once dominant in politics and society, were marginalized, and their heritage was diminished or erased in popular histories. The dominant American narrative celebrating California's development as a rescue from Mexican misrule is critically examined as a myth that glosses over displacement, injustice, and cultural loss. Invitation for further exploration. The documentary closes by urging viewers to rethink traditional historical narratives about California. It invites scholars, students, and the general public to recognize the complexities and contested realities of the state's past. For those interested in diving deeper, the film offers pathways to explore critical events and issues in greater detail, such as the full text and implications of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the origins, legal battles, and human stories behind the California Land Act of 1851. The lived experiences and legacy of the Californio families displaced by conquest. The impact of Manifest Destiny ideology on U.S.-Mexico relations and indigenous peoples, sex, and resources. You want assistance locating the full documentary, recommendations for viewing platforms, or detailed research materials on these topics? I'm here to help. Whether for academic study, personal interest, or teaching purposes. There are a variety of resources available, including archival documents, expert analyses, and oral histories that illuminate California's complex transition.